Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how Labour leader Keir Starmer is tackling the fact that Boris Johnson has clearly now got no intention of getting the COVID pandemic under control ahead of what the Chief Medical Officer has called a long winter. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So it's very serious subjects, but ultimately what we're going to be discussing here is finely balanced politics. And in judging the relative wisdom of how political leaders handle situations, I always defer to the impact on public opinion. Public opinion has been shifting consistently and decisively towards Labour, and especially towards Starmer since he became Labour leader. Now, there are a couple of stances that he has adopted that I have not agreed with and continue to not agree with on both COVID and Brexit, but I have at least taken the time to understand his differing stance, and when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, his way has worked. I can imagine if I want to be combative, my way would have worked better. The bottom line is his way has worked. That's all there is to it. I can agree or disagree. Others can agree or disagree. As long as public opinion moves further to his side, at the end of the day, what he's doing is right. Now, take COVID, for example. So Starmer made a point for the last half year of adopting a strategy of supporting government measures to contain the virus, but also asking questions when they weren't working. And let's face facts, they have almost never worked. The reason then was obvious. When Starmer became leader, the public was still largely on board with the government's efforts. Even when it was obvious certain things were not going right, the public at large, polling made it very clear, believed the government were doing their best. You know, that was all there was to it. Some said when Starmer, when I'm going to talk about in a minute, it's about time he's stepping up his attacks on the government's response to COVID. That is not only to ignore his obvious success in the public eye, but if he had have attacked them before when people said he should, that would have done two things. Firstly, it would set the people who were rallying around the government, as people generally do in an emergency, against the new Labour leadership. Second, it would risk being seen as undermining efforts to control the virus. And don't get me wrong, Johnson is trying the second one anyway. He frequently puts the blame of COVID failures at the feet of Starmer for undermining the government's message. He brings it into PMQs almost every week. Talks about how Starmer has undermined the message. But it is having limited impact in the public because the public can see it's not true. Starmer has not argued against any government measure or restriction at any time until now. He has said they don't go far enough at times, or he has bemoaned the incompetent handling, which means that the results of those measures have not been good enough. But he never once gainsaid the measures. He supported the measures fully, and he's made it clear that he supported the measures. Now the political scenery is changing, and an effective leader obviously needs to change with it. You do not get long in politics to adapt or die. A couple of things are very different to half a year ago. A couple of things are now evident, which were not the case before. First of all, the public is increasingly pissed off with the government's bumbling over COVID measures. Many people agree that the measures we have now do not go far enough. A poll this week has shown that a majority of people think that the government should have been put in place the tougher restrictions that were advised weeks ago by SAGE, the scientific advisory group. But there are also people who think the measures go too far. They don't want the measures in place at all. And it makes no difference whether people think the measures are not enough or are too much. Both of those groups of people are against the government's handling right now. Second change is that it is now clear that the government are not intending to get on top of the pandemic. Before, it could be seen as incompetence. You know, they sort of had the right general strategy. They were just implementing it very badly. Now it's fairly obvious the government have no interest in halting this pandemic. The government's own advisors have described the time as crucial. We should have acted sooner, and then we could have limited the measures. We now need to enact very tough measures indeed. If we don't, and we are not doing, then we are utterly boned this winter. I think that's the technical term. Yeah, I think that's what Sage said. We're utterly boned this winter. Or words to that effect. Against that background, Boris Johnson is clearly intending to go into full blame mode, supporting the measures but arguing that they should go further or that handling should be more competent is not going to cut it now in a different phase. When the oncoming disaster really unfolds over the next 5 or 6 months, Johnson is going to look back and seek to suggest, well, yes, it's bad, it's a right old mess, but nobody could have done it better. I did the best that it was possible to do. And he will say, he'll say it's the fault of Labour, of doctors, of nurses, anyone that isn't him. As I said recently in a video, Labour cannot afford for that line to work in the public. Doesn't matter how much Johnson says it, it mustn't work in the public eye. Johnson will use it. That's inevitable. What they must do is to stop people believing that a government with a huge majority in Parliament and emergency powers to do whatever they like, as well as hundreds of billions of pounds of extra borrowing, cannot have managed the situation better. Of course they could have managed it better. Of course they should have managed it better. And people need to realise that. So against the news that SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, the government's scientific advisors, suggested a series of measures that Boris Johnson did not adopt. Keir Starmer held a press conference yesterday. In it, he called for the measures suggested by SAGE to be implemented without delay. Now, Keir Starmer is calling for a couple of things here. First of all, he's basically saying, I think the government should follow the scientific advice, which means he's putting the government in a position where it has to say, well, I don't agree that we should follow the scientific advice. They like to use the phrase, we're being led by the science. They are not, and it's increasingly clear they are not. He also called for the tracing system to be run by local authorities. Again, something that the experts have been urging the government to do from the start. This is not, as some people tried to suggest, party political. At the same time, it's a party's leader's job to be party political, but this isn't. At the end of the day, he's not saying we should do this because, that's what Labour believe. He's saying we should do this because that's what the experts believe. The experts you appointed, Boris Johnson, your experts, have said we should do this. He also pointed out that if the government locks down now, one of the weeks of that lockdown, that circuit breaker as it's being called, would be covered by half term when kids would be out of schools and colleges anyway. Take advantage. The plan right now isn't working. The 3-tier system announced by the government at the start of the week is easier to understand, yeah, but measures contained within it are not effective enough. So it's easy to understand, but it doesn't do the job. It's a bit like, throwing someone out of a plane. Instead of a parachute, you give them a spork. You explain to them how the spork works. Oh, that's grand. I get that now. How does this help me plummet to my death safely? Actually, if you plummet to your death, it's not very safe, is it? Local authorities in harder hit areas have also endorsed this nation as well. So, provided it comes with financial assistance, that's what they've insisted on. And of course, that needs to be part of it as well. So what we've got is a situation now where Keir Starmer is calling for the scientific advisors' advice to be followed. He's on the side of the public with that. Although interestingly, if you look at the breakdown on that polling, although a majority of the public think that we should be adopting what the scientists say, not a majority of Conservative voters. There you go. He's also on the side of local authorities. And another thing that's happening here, and this is where the politics is. Starmer is right now to step up his attacks on the government measures, not just their handling. He's been on their handling of it from the start. But now the measures, in a way that would not have worked before, wouldn't have worked. Not because it'll change anything. Boris Johnson's got emergency powers and he's got a massive majority. You can't really change that. But it traps Johnson, completely traps him. Because if Boris Johnson ignores the Labour calls to adopt the SAGE advice, then this second wave will get dangerously out of hand. It's not a gamble, this. The government are not gambling. It is inevitable. Scientists have been clear about that. The course is inevitable if we do not have tough restrictions now. There have already been enough lives blighted by our useless handling of the crisis. Many more will still be destroyed by this action over the coming seasons, or rather inaction. But if Boris Johnson, albeit later on, maybe in a week or two, finally accepts that the tougher restrictions are required as the only way to avert a winter crisis, again, it'll be much later on. It'll have to be even tougher to have any real impact. And not for the first time this year, he'll be following a course that Labour will have argued beforehand. It will once again show the people that in a time of crisis, Labour come to the correct decisions more quickly than the Conservatives do. And that's inevitable. That cannot now be stopped by Boris Johnson, no matter what he does. If he doesn't announce tight restrictions at any point in the next few months, we are bound, to use the technical term, and people will see that what Labour were calling for, which is ultimately all the scientists were calling for, was the correct decision. If Boris Johnson does put it in place, but later on, again, it looks like he's coming to that conclusion after Labour have. Boris Johnson has trapped himself. And that's why it's the right move now, politically speaking. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.